Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore. It is the Christmas season, so it's also time for ghost stories. And we do talk a lot about the link between spirits and Halloween, but in Tudor England there was a special fear of spirits at Christmas. In 1553, Thomas Kirkmire wrote, "For these 3 nights are always thought unfortunate to be, wherein they are afraid of sprites and cankered witches' spite, and dreadful devils black and grim that then have chiefest might." The winter solstice was likewise associated with ghosts and ghost stories in Elizabethan England. Now, while the winter solstice might fall tomorrow in the UK, I felt it made today the best time to share my take on the Christmas ghost story. And yes, I do have some help along the way. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. I'd always hated driving at night, especially after the introduction of dazzling white LED headlights that left after echoes on your retina for what felt like an hour, but it was the only way to get back from the small village where I'd agreed to host a Christmas folklore-themed pub quiz. Everyone had a marvellous time and wandered home, except I now had to navigate the winding roads back to my hotel on the other side of the moor. Not only that, but it had started to snow. Flakes fell small and soft at first, bigger and more obvious later, as I got further away from the village and closer to the heart of the moor. You can probably imagine the somewhat colourful language that escaped me when my car's engine began to sputter. The headlights kept cutting in and out, the beams strobing in the falling snow, and I looked at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was fine, and none of the warning indicators were on, but the engine just did not want to do its job. I kept going, hoping it would behave as it warmed up, but it didn't. Eventually, as I tried to creep along a narrow lane in the dark, the engine gave a throaty cough that did not sound at all healthy. Of all the places to break down, I had to choose a moor late at night in the snow. Wonderful. I glanced at my phone on the passenger seat. I tapped the screen to wake it up and saw the dreaded no service message. Looking back at the road, I peered through the windscreen, looking for somewhere safe to bring the car to a full stop. There, up ahead, there was a house. I could just about make out its outline against the night sky thanks to the snow clinging to its roof. Well, it wasn't really a house as such, more of a cottage, but why split hairs? Shelter was shelter. It stood back from the road, although I couldn't make out any details. I managed to coax the car the last few yards along the road and into the small lay-by outside the cottage. At that point, the engine sputtered and finally died. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. Damn. I got out and fished the old reflective triangle my dad had given me out of the boot, and then strapped it to the back of the car, so anyone coming along the road in the dark would see the car in the lay-by and hopefully not run into the back of it. Not that I expected that many cars came along here in the dead of night, but still, better to be safe than sorry. I also found the larger of the 2 torches I carried in the boot, along with a wind-up radio, a bottle of water and some snacks, and then locked the car. I hoped somebody would be home, but if they weren't, it wouldn't hurt to have some supplies to hand. The garden gate shrieked as I pushed it open, its hinges practically rusted shut. Either the occupant didn't get out much, or there was no occupant. Either way, I was in the middle of nowhere in a snowstorm with no phone signal, and I had the choice between seeing if I could get help from the cottage or sleeping in the car and walking to the nearest occupied house in the morning. There was no way I was walking over the moors at night in the snow, even if I did have the torch. For one thing, I knew the vague direction but had no idea what the terrain was like, and for another, I'd heard the stories of vicious creatures that lived among the bogs, eager to lure unsuspecting travellers into danger. I also didn't fancy freezing to death if I took a fall and the snow got any heavier. No thanks. Yes, true, I could have just simply followed the road, but then that put me at the mercy of any passing drivers who had to contend with the snow, let alone watching out for me. I swung the torch across the front garden of the cottage. Bushes clustered along the edges, but shrank away from the lone hawthorn tree standing right in the centre of the lawn. I swept the torchlight across the tree and spotted fat, juicy haws hanging from its branches. Well, at least something was thriving out here in the middle of nowhere, even if it was a lone hawthorn. Something made me do a weird curtsy-type movement to the tree as I passed, my boots crunching on the snow already drifting on the front path. I got to the front door and shook my head at myself. Who curtsies to a tree? I knocked on the front door and listened for any movement inside. The front door was a pane of frosted glass set into pale wood, and I could see a pile of mail splayed across the floor inside. I tried the doorbell, but it just made a clunk noise when I pressed it. I even tiptoed across to the front window and peered inside. It was too dark to see much of anything, but the whole house gave off an air of emptiness. Now I should point out, I wouldn't normally just randomly open someone's front door, but with no one answering my knocks and the snow getting heavier, I felt I had no choice. I tried the door handle, telling myself I'd just go and sleep in the car if it was locked. I would figure out how to keep warm later. The door opened, its hinges protesting in agreement with the front gate. "Hello?" I called. Silence replied, echoing the eerie muffled silence of snowfall behind me. I tried the light switch inside the door, but nothing happened. So I closed the front door behind me and, stepping over the accumulated mail, moved down the hall. I tried another light switch beside the door to the front room. Nothing. I poked my head into the kitchen at the back. A kitchen straight out of the 1930s lay in the torchlight, dust clinging to its formica surfaces. Something scuttled across the floor and dived beneath what looked like it might be a refrigerator if you'd let a child draw a picture of one with a crayon. I promptly closed the kitchen door and retreated into the hall. Whatever that was running across the floor could keep the kitchen. Besides, I had my bottled water. I wouldn't need to drink whatever foul water might come out of the ancient tap. I checked the other room off the hall, which proved to be a bedroom. A single bed crouched against a boxy wardrobe, and the spirals on the wallpaper seemed to move as I swung the torch beam across the room, although they stopped when I made an effort to look directly at them. It had to be an optical illusion. Had to be. But like the kitchen, the bedroom felt like a room from an earlier era, one that hadn't quite caught up with the present time. By the time I got to the front room, I'd worked out that all the electrics in the cottage were dead. Given the sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance, I didn't think that was necessarily a bad thing. But the front room, that was a bit different from the other rooms. It still looked like a room that the 20th century had forgotten, except it also had a huge inviting sofa, like the kind you see in TV ads for furniture shops that permanently have a sale on. A wooden coffee table with feet carved to look like paws sat between the sofa and the fireplace, and a shiny brass coal scuttle filled with coal stood in the corner. Now, I'd seen enough house renovation programmes to know an abandoned house when I saw one. Only this one didn't have the detritus I'd expect to see lying around, or the peeling paint, or the mildewed wallpaper. In this room, the only stuff that I'd found was things I was actually happy to see, like the sofa and the coal scuttle. Even better, a collection of barely used white pillar candles was lined up along the mantelpiece beneath the mirror. It was almost as if the house knew what I wanted and made sure it was there. I mentally kicked myself for that one. Houses aren't sentient. This one couldn't have preempted my thoughts and provided physical items. That was just silly. No, I was just very fortunate to have found somewhere safe and dry to spend the night before I set out in search of a phone signal tomorrow. I didn't let myself think about who might have been providing the physical items I needed if it wasn't the house, or why they were doing so. Having explored the cottage, I also deduced it had no indoor bathroom, but I also couldn't see an outhouse in the back garden through the small window in the hall. Another swift trip into the weird bedroom with the swirling wallpaper revealed a dusty chamber pot under the bed, and I took it into the front room, hoping I wouldn't have to actually use it during the night. I decided the front room was the safest space in the cottage, and I could still just about see my car in the snow from the front window. I had a firelighter hanging from my keychain, so I managed to get the fire and the candles lit. With the flames blazing away in the hearth and the candles a cheery blaze on the mantelpiece, the front room felt almost cosy, especially with the snow falling outside. So I sat on the sofa, and for the want of anything else to do, I watched the candle flames dancing. It was so strange. After a while, I realised they were actually dancing in sync with each other. Each of them bowed and wiggled the same way, as if it were the same flame replicated along the row of candles, rather than a series of individual flames. The longer I stared, it was almost as if I could hear a voice coming from them, a voice I didn't recognise, but which seemed to put me at ease anyway.
Draw a little closer to the fire. let the shadows gather where they wish, for this is a story best told when the wind worries at the eaves, when the night stretches long across the valley, and where the old spirits walk a little nearer to our world. As they do, as they say, on the nights surrounding Christmas. Now you've heard of the Laddie Wen, haven't you? The White Lady. She drifts through many Welsh tales, sometimes a guardian, sometimes a warning, and sometimes a soul who has not found her rest. But the story I am about to share, this one came to me from an old shepherd of the upper Towie Valley, a man named Dafydd Llyn Ddu, who claimed that what he saw one Christmas Eve changed the course of his life forever. He told it quietly. He told it rarely. And when he told it to me, there was something in his eyes that made me believe in every word. So, listen well. Dafydd was a solitary sort, happiest among the sheep, the wind and the hills. He lived alone in a place called Tir Onnen, a cottage crouched beneath a bent old ash tree that looked for all the world as if it had leaned too close to hear a secret and had never recovered from the shock of it. Every Christmas Eve, Dafydd had a ritual. He would walk up the steep, frost-tipped track to check upon his flock one last time before midnight mass. Not that he often made that service, mind you, but the bells of Llanfawr Church always drifted up the valley, like a hymn carried on snow. This particular year, it must have been around 1952, I reckon. He thought the winter came early, carried on the breath of the north wind. The river was rimmed with white, and the sheep kept close to the old dry stone walls, heads down, breath smoking like dragons in the cold. And Dafydd set out with lantern in hand, and his greatcoat wrapped tight, the moon glazed yellow behind a gauze of cloud. He made it halfway up the slope when he noticed something strange. The whole world had fallen silent. Not the usual winter quiet, mind, not the soft hush that comes when snow blankets everything, but a deeper silence, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. No wind, no river, not even the bleating of sheep, just a stillness that pressed against him like a hand laid upon the chest. He stood there, lantern flickering, and he felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. For a moment, he thought he saw movement by the twisted hawthorn that marked the boundaries of his land, a pale shimmer, no more than mist, or so he told himself. But then he heard it. A cry, soft, far off, a woman's voice drifting through the air like a forgotten hymn. He gripped the lantern tighter. Dafydd was not a man easily frightened, but that sound carried sorrow in it, deep as the midnight well. He stepped towards the hawthorn, and there, between the twisted branches, stood a woman clothed all in white, her face as pale as frost, and her hair flowing like moonlight in water. A Laddie Wen. She turned her head towards him, though her feet, he noticed, never touched the ground. "Dafydd Llyn Ddu," she whispered, though his name had never been spoken to her. "Come." Now you might think a sensible man would turn back at that moment, rush home, bolt the door, and leave the spirit wandering. But Dafydd was Welsh to the bone, and the Welsh have always believed that when a spirit calls your name, you listen. He stepped nearer, The air round her grew startlingly cold, so cold his breath fell as crystals onto his coat. She lifted a hand, and from within her sleeve, as pale as she was, she held a small candle. It burned with a thin blue flame. "Carry this," she said, "for there is one who waits in the dark and cannot come home alone." Before he could reply, she placed the candle in his trembling hand and vanished. The silence broke like glass. The wind rushed back in a low moan, and far below the river sighed, and somewhere a sheep bleated. Dafydd stood alone by the hawthorn, the strange blue candle steady in his palm. And then, from the direction of the old quarry came another sound, a whimper, childlike, weak, pleading. He felt the call of it in his ribs, and so he went. The path to the quarry had not been walked in years. Dark rocks jutted like broken teeth from the hillside. Old tales said the place was unlucky, that men had fallen, that tools flew from hands as if pushed, that the shadows moved where shadows should not. But Dafydd did not believe in such talk, or at least he had not, until a laddie wen placed her candle in his hand. And the flame glowed brighter with each step he took toward the darkness. And when he reached the mouth of the quarry, the wind died again. His breath rose in clouds, and the blue light spilled long, narrow shadows across the frozen stones. At first he saw nothing, just the black throat of the earth and the jagged arms of rock. But then, there curled against the fallen slab, a little boy, thin as winter branches, his clothes ragged, barefoot though the ground shimmered with frost. "Mister," the child whispered, "please, I can't find my mum." Dafydd's heart tightened. He crouched down beside the boy. "What's your name, Bach?" "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Eirian." Dafydd frowned. There were no Eirians in the valley anymore, not since the family left after the tragedy decades ago. He looked again at the boy's pale face, and a thought, cold and unwelcome, slipped into his mind. The boy was shivering terribly, yet no cloud of breath came from his lips. "Come on, Thomas," Dafydd said softly, lifting him easily. "Let me take you home." And he straightened, and then something tugged gently at his coat. He turned, and behind him, just for a heartbeat, stood a laddie wen. Her face was soft with sorrow. She nodded once, as if urging him on, and then she was gone. The walk back to the track felt longer than any Dafydd had taken. The candle burned as bright as ever, though the wind tried its best to smother it. The boy clung to him, cold seeping through Dafydd's greatcoat like ice water. "Where did you come from, Thomas?" Dafydd asked. The boy shook his head. "I was looking for Mum. She said she'd be back for Christmas, but she never came. She never came." His voice trailed into a sob so small that Dafydd felt his eyes sting. "Don't worry, Bach," he said gently. "We'll find her." But deep down, deep as the quarry pit, he suspected the truth. As they neared the hawthorn, the candle flickered wildly, though there was no wind. The branches rustled, and the air grew still once more. And from the white mist stepped a laddie wen. Her eyes, oh, her eyes, they glistened like dew on winter graves. "Give me the child," she said. Thomas stirred in Dafydd's arms, turning towards her, not with fear, but recognition. "Mum," he whispered, and the white lady smiled, a smile full of longing and love and heartbreak. "Ie fy mab," she breathed. "Yes, my son." Yes. David felt the weight in his arms grow lighter, like mist slipping through fingers, and Thomas reached towards her. Their hands touched, and in that moment the White Lady changed. Her face warmed with colour, her gown shimmered as if woven from morning light. Her feet touched the earth at last. Mother and child embraced beneath the old bent hawthorn, and David, a grown man with a life of solitude, found tears spilling freely down his cheeks. "Thank you, diolch," she whispered to him, "for guiding him home." She kissed her lips to her son's hair, a kiss of farewell, and the both of them began to fade, their bodies dissolving into soft white light like snow in a river, and just before they vanished completely, the White Lady turned back to David. "On Christmas Eve," she said, "light a candle for the lost, and none shall walk in darkness alone." Then she and the boy were gone. The candle in David's hand flickered once, twice, then went out. David never forgot that night, and from that Christmas Eve onward he placed a candle, a simple white candle, in the window of Tir Onnen for all to see, and it burned every Christmas Eve without fail. And the strange things that happened in the years that followed. Travellers lost in the snow found their way to his door. A child once wandered from the village and was guided by the soft white glow back to the path. Even an old collier from Abercraf swore that a pale woman led him to safety after he slipped on the icy road near the ash tree. David never claimed credit. He simply smiled and nodded, and spoke softly of the kindness of Christmas. But those who knew him well noticed that each year on the night before Christmas he would step outside, look towards the twisted hawthorn, and whisper a greeting to someone unseen. So if you ever find yourself walking a Welsh valley on Christmas Eve, and if the wind falls silent and the night grows hushed, and a pale glow flickers in the corner of your eye, do not be afraid, for it may be a laddie Wen wandering still, looking for those who are lost and guiding them gently home. And if you see a candle burning in a lonely window, perhaps lift your hat and give thanks to David Llyndy, who once carried a blue flame through the dark and helped a mother find her child on a cold, cold Christmas Eve.
I stared at the candles, realising they'd been lit for around 10 minutes, yet they hadn't actually burned down. They were the exact same height they'd been when I lit them. There were no drips of wax down the sides either, nothing to say they were even burning, aside from the hypnotic dancing flames. I got up and crossed the room, waving my hand around them. I expected to feel the warmth of the flames, but there was nothing. Something made me pick up the candle at the end of the row and stand it on the windowsill. The flame flickered, reflected in the glass, and threw a tiny sliver of light into the front garden, where it shimmered between the snowflakes. I caught sight of the lone hawthorn, black against the rapidly deepening snow, and withdrew from the window, suddenly feeling more visible than I was comfortable with. I remembered the scene in Poltergeist when the tree burst through the window and seized the young boy, and shuddered. I moved back towards the fireplace. These flames definitely cast warmth into the room, and they somehow felt like the most real thing about this whole place. I knelt on the floor in front of the fire, rubbing my hands like a Dickensian urchin in a freezing garret. Yes, that would do. I'd just stay there for a while. I looked up and realised that the row of candles had gone out. Only the candle in the window continued to burn, with a trickle of wax now making its way down the side of the pillar. I'd always hated the expression that I'd read in horror novels when a character felt a cold slug of fear crawl down their spine, thinking it was quite hackneyed and overused, but I won't lie, it perfectly summed up how I felt looking at those cold dark candles while the one at the window burned normally. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see someone peering in, but only snow swirled in the darkness outside. The snowstorm had definitely grown in strength since I came inside, putting paid to any notion of sleeping in the car without a working heater or following the road along to the next village. Still, I had the roaring fire in here, and I added another couple of coals for good measure. I sat back to admire my handiwork and bumped my lower back against something hard. I twisted around and noticed a round knob sticking out of the coffee table. Oh, it had a drawer! How strange it didn't face the sofa, but then that wasn't even the weirdest thing about this cottage. I pulled on the handle, half expecting the drawer to be locked, but it gave way and the drawer slid open easily. I picked up the torch from the table and shone it into the drawer. There was an old blue school exercise book and a pristine bar of chocolate wrapped in foil lying at the bottom, on top of a drawer liner made of the same swirling wallpaper from the bedroom. I suddenly remembered every M.R. James story I'd ever read, and I wondered if examining the exercise book was a terrible idea. Still, I actually had nothing better to do, and I thought that the exercise book might give me some clues as to who the cottage belonged to. Yes, I could have looked at the mail in the hall, but most of that had actually looked like takeaway pizza menus. Speaking of food, I suddenly felt hungry. But as inviting as the chocolate bar looked, it did feel weird eating food I'd found in a random house. Using the coal or lighting the candle seemed justified given my need for light and heat, but eating something when I brought my own snacks offended a principle of hospitality that I didn't realise I had. Besides, who knew how old the chocolate was? The rest of the house was a museum piece, so it would be bizarre if the chocolate was best before any date after the turn of the millennium. I wolfed down one of my protein bars instead, before I opened the exercise book. It was full of cramped but neat handwriting, as if someone had a lot they wanted to say, but they weren't sure if they had enough room to get it all down on paper. I held the torch above the pages and started reading.
I had written of murders, of bankruptcies, of civic disturbances and labour strikes, all labours without thanks, yet each of them preferable to the commission that now sent me northward. It concerned a death in Perthshire, the passing of a young man of little consequence, save for a name already half forgotten, and a house burdened with a darker reputation than it earned. The train departed Waverley belatedly, its carriages but sparsely filled, the air within carrying the smell of damp wool and coal smoke. Word had reached us that the snow might hinder our progress beyond Stirling, and the windows were already thick with sleet, which blurred the city into a haze of grey. I confess I resented the errand before we'd even cleared the suburbs. My editor, leaning back in his chair, had smiled with a satisfaction that bespoke relief rather than favour, as he consigned the matter to me. Not merely an obituary, he said, with the air of one imparting a gift. There is a story in it. Belechin House. You'll have heard the tales. Indeed, who in Edinburgh had not? The name had long carried whispers of curses, of spectral hounds, of a family undone by some hereditary malady. Such talk was normally the province of taverns, where rumour grows fat upon ale, not of a paper that prized fact and the testimony of living men. Yet here I was, pressed against the chill of the window, watching the sleet whiten to snow as we rattled northward. Upon the bench at my side rested a bundle of journals, tied with string and surrendered to me in Perth by a solicitor, whose relief at their removal was plain to see. "You will require these," he had murmured, as though divesting himself of some unwholesome burden. "If you are resolved to write of the boy, this is all that remains." I had promised myself I wouldn't open them until I reached Belechin. It was the sort of resolve that flatters professional discipline, yet falters when hours stretch upon the long line. The countryside, made spectral by falling snow, had already thinned time to a monotony. When at last the train halted upon some wind-struck cutting, its lamps flickering in the draught, I undid the knot. The first page bore the faint scent of lavender and dust. The hand was neat at the beginning, each letter carefully drawn, as though the writer still sought order. I began to read. July 1896. The house is mine now. It feels less like inheritance than sentence. I walk its corridors and hear him and the hounds we destroyed. Their absence is louder than their presence ever was. I thought to free the place of their noise. Now I hear them all the same, in dreams at least. Last night they were at the door, scratching, whining. I woke to silence, but the latch was marked, as though something had clawed at the wood. The voice that spoke in those pages was one I knew well enough, the voice of solitude, of a man left with too much house and too little company. Scratching, dreams, overwrought fancy, not scandal, nor anything to fill a column with profit. Yet there was an earnestness in the strokes, sharpened by some inner torment which gave me pause. Still the train did not stir. Snow pressed hard against the glass, muffling the world beyond. And so, with nothing to distract me but the sound of my own breath in the chill, I turned another page. August 1896. The servants only last a week. They complain of noises, of howling in the walls. A girl swore she saw a shape on the stair, low to the ground, eyes glinting. I dismissed her, and she left by morning. The house is large, but it does not need to be so empty. Still, perhaps it's for the best. I would not wish them to hear what I hear each night. The howls are closer now. They circle the house like hounds on a fox. Sometimes, when I light a lantern, I see nothing. Other times, in the corner of my eye, I swear I catch a shadow moving. I tell myself it's only tiredness, but if that is so, why does it follow me into the daylight? Already the hand was altering. Strokes grown hurried, words tumbling after one another as though the writer sought to outpace his own recollections. September 1896. I no longer know where the dream ends. I woke, or thought I woke, to barking in the corridor. The press of paws on the boards outside my door. I dared not open. For an hour I listened to the padding back and forth, the growl deep in its throat. At last it stopped, and when I found the courage to look, the passage was empty, but the air stank of dog, and the wood bore the mark of claws. This morning in the stable yard I found the body of a fox, ripped and bloodless. The men in the village will say it was hounds, but there are no hounds at Belechin. Not any more. The carriage groaned beneath the weight of the snow. I looked up from the page and caught my reflection in the black window pane, pale and severe. For a moment I thought to knot the bundle again, to defer my curiosity until more appropriate hours. Yet the storm without and the words within seemed in conspiracy, pressing me forward. The later entries grew darker still. Sentences shortened. The hand slanted and broke. Lamps guttered without wind. Doors opened to silent corridors. A lantern was found shattered high among the rafters, as though dashed by some paw. One entry told of a tenant's child who woke shrieking of yellow eyes, and quitted the house the next morning, mute and trembling. Another recorded the departure of the housekeeper, her only explanation, "I cannot stay where it hunts." December 1896. They are here, not in dream, nor in shadow, but in the house itself. I hear their nails upon the stair, their breath at the keyhole. I barred the door, yet it opens still. Their eyes burn in the dark. I have no strength left to fight them, nor forgiveness to hope for. If these pages are found, let them know it was I who killed them, and now they return for me. I am not one given to belief in curses. I prefer the testimony of neighbours to the whispers of gossips, the record of ledgers to the mutterings of old wives. And yet these pages resisted all easy dismissal. When I closed the journal, I found myself thinking of the young man who'd written them, dead within a week of the final entry. At length the train lurched forward once more, the lamps swinging with the motion. One passenger, drawing his collar close, muttered against the ill fortune of travelling so near to Christmas Eve. Stories change a man, I reflected. They demand pursuit. And as the carriage rocked, and the snow beat against the glass, I found myself listening. Not for the rumble of the engine, but for another sound altogether. A bark, a howl, some sign that the words upon the page were already loosed into the night. I laid the book aside, though my hand shook as I did so. Outside the snow lay heavy upon the fields, a white shroud over all. They said it was some fit, a collapse of the nerves. Yet the villagers spoke in tones lowered to a whisper, of doors splintered, of claw marks on the bedstead, of a cry that carried into the night, and was silenced mid-breath. There were no hounds at Belechin, not then, but the house had held their memory, and in the end, it seemed they had claimed their master back.
I dropped the exercise book and it landed on the coffee table with a sharp thud. What the hell was that? Between that and the story I heard in the candle flame, and even saying that aloud seemed like a weird sentence to say, I genuinely considered going to sleep in the car, snowstorm or not. This place was just weird, and not in a good way. I thought of all the people who posted online about wanting to live in the middle of nowhere away from people, and wondered if they'd say the same if they came across this place. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Still no signal, though it was apparently 10 past midnight. Oh, good, I thought, I'm into the witching hour. I glanced at the radio I'd brought in from the car, and then I thought maybe I'm just freaked out because I'm not used to so much silence. After all, even when I was at home alone, there would be music playing, or podcasts in the background, or even just noises from the neighbours. Here, there was just the crackle of the fire. Perhaps a spot of Radio 4 would perk me up, or whatever station I could manage to find. For once, I actually thanked the government for one of their decisions in deciding to postpone turning off analogue radio for a while, as this thing certainly wouldn't be picking up digital stations anytime soon. I cranked the handle on the side for a couple of minutes, giving me about 40 minutes of playback time. That should be enough to help me doze off, and then I would hopefully wake in the morning, able to face my car situation in daylight. I scanned the stations, mostly finding static, until I landed on a clear station. A comforting male voice rang out in the room, so crisp it was as if he was sat beside me. I added another couple of coals to the fire, hauled the fire guard in front of the flames to stop any rogue spark setting the place alight, and set the radio on the table. I curled up on the sofa and prepared to get myself comfortable. Only then did I finally pay attention to what the voice was saying.
This tale is a true tale, or at least true enough if you believe the sorts of stories that aristocrats share over brandy and cigars with their friends. Nevertheless, the subject of this story, Lord Dufferin, swore to its veracity and more, believed that he was one of the rare people who had been given a glimpse into the other side. And this is the tale that he told. He was a young man, an aristocrat, of course, but this was the era of Queen Victoria. And it was the sort of days when aristocrats could no longer afford to simply swan about their castles, oppressing peasants. They had to get real jobs, lords or not. And Dufferin, like many of his aristocratic peers, got a job in the civil service. Now, at first, he did his work from an office in London, but London, if you've never been there, is rather a noisy place with plenty of distractions for a young man. And so Lord Dufferin found that it was rather difficult to get any work done. And so he did what any of us might have done in his situation, and he went to stay in his friend's castle. It's sometimes nice being an aristocrat and having access to friends in high places, friends with castles with rooms to spare. And so he travelled over to Ireland to stay with his friend for a few months and found himself put up in a room at the top floor of his friend's home. Now, I call it a castle, but this place was more what you would call a stately home, a great gravel drive, white under the moonlight, stretched through the deer parks, lined with dark trees on either side, up to the front of a great house with wings on either side, east and west, with rows and rows of sashed windows all the way along. And one of these rooms, Dufferin found himself on the top floor with a window that faced out over the drive. Now, he was what you might call a night owl. That is to say, he did his best work in the darkness. I think many of us can probably sympathise with that. He was not a man to get up before noon, but he would often work late into the night. And one night, he found himself working in the room that his friend had given him, his desk placed near the window, with a little carriage clock to mark the passage of time. He was sifting through some official paperwork when he heard the ding that told him that it was 1 o'clock in the morning. This was soon followed by another ding ding to tell him that 2 o'clock in the morning had come, and he thought to himself, well, the time is almost here when I should be getting myself to bed. I'll give it till 3 o'clock in the morning. So you may be sure that he was listening for those 3 little dings. So imagine then his surprise when ding, 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 ding sounded from the carriage clock. He gazed over at the clock, and sure enough, the hands read 4 o'clock. How strange, he thought. How can 4 have come before 3? And he stood up, and he walked over to the curtains of the room and drew them to the sides. And imagine then his surprise when sunlight streamed in through the windows. He looked out over the drive, and everything was exactly as if it were in the middle of the daytime. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, rather than 4 in the morning. There was only one thing in the view that was out of place, saving the sun shining in the sky, and that was that when he looked down at his friend's drive of white gravel, lined with green trees, there, parked by the front of the house, was a hearse. A great black carriage with huge wheels and 4 great horses with plumes of black feathers on their heads. In the back of the hearse was a coffin, open and empty. And sitting on the little seat at the front of the carriage was the undertaker in his tall black hat and long black coat. Dufferin stared at the strange figure and swore that as he did so, the figure turned and fixed him with its glare. And there was something so unutterably horrible about the man's face and his expression that Dufferin stepped back from the window with shock and swore that the look on that man's face was burned at that moment into his mind and that he never forgot it. For the man stared seemingly straight into his soul, put his thumb over his back, and gestured to the coffin that stood empty in the back of the hearse, and spoke. And somehow, over that distance, Dufferin swore he could hear the man say, "Room for one more inside, sir." What the correct course of action to take in this situation is, I do not know. But I can tell you what Lord Dufferin did, which was to close the curtains immediately and step back. Catching his breath, he looked down again at the carriage clock, which now seemed to read 1 minute past 3. He opened the curtains slowly and peered outside into the darkness. He saw the light of the moon shining gently on the gravel and the dark trees, and there was no sign anywhere of the hearse. Dufferin thought for a moment that he may have been dreaming, that he had nodded off in his chair. But when he tried to go to sleep that night, the face of the undertaker seemed to haunt him. The next morning, he went downstairs to his friend, and over breakfast, he tried to raise the subject. He talked of ghosts and asked if there were any legends in that part of the world, for he had heard, as we all have, of headless coachmen arriving at castles in the middle of the night, and although this hearse driver had his head attached, he was so ghastly that he felt sure that this was some phantom or spectre. But his friend seemed to laugh it off. "No," he said, "I should really have asked for money off the old place, shouldn't I? After all, what's any castle worth without a ghost or two? A fellow with his head under his arm, or something that clank chains about the place? But no, absolutely nothing here, I'm afraid." Dufferin laughed it off, but inside he didn't feel much like laughing. And he said that for years afterwards, every time he opened his curtains, he half expected to see that awful face staring in at him through the window. Years passed. Decades, in fact, and Dufferin rose through the ranks of the civil service and through the ranks of society. His father died, and he inherited his title and became, in truth, Lord Dufferin. And eventually, as an older man, he was appointed the ambassador from the British government to France, and he was sent over to Paris. Now, the house that he was to live in on the outskirts of Paris was not yet ready to receive him, and so he had to spend 6 weeks or so in the Grand Hotel in Paris. Not such a hardship, you might think. But he arrived one day in the busy city, and the hotel was already swarming with guests and with staff, and his servants brought his luggage in behind him, and they were going to make for the main staircase when they remembered that, of course, this was the 1890s. Hotels now were fully equipped with lifts to get them to the top floor, and so they made their way to the lift. Dufferin was barely paying attention, but he saw that the lift was very full, crammed, in fact, with people, and he saw the red uniform of the lift attendant who was stood outside the lift. And he was just trying to make up his mind as to whether to try and get inside or whether to wait for the lift to arrive back down, when he heard suddenly the voice of the lift attendant. "Room for one more inside, sir." Chill of horror went up his spine, and his eyes opened wide as he stared at the lift attendant and swore that the face of the man was the same as the face of the undertaker that had stared in at him through the window of his friend's castle all those decades ago. He stumbled back, the colour drained from his face. His servants had to almost catch him to prevent him from falling, and they sat him on a nearby couch to regain his composure. They saw that he was staring at the grandfather clock that stood in the corridor. But a few moments later, their attention was taken from this piece of the furniture by the screams of staff and guests in the hotel. People were running here and there in every direction, for as the lift reached the very top, the cable had snapped, and the lift had plummeted from the top to the very bottom basement of the hotel and been smashed into pieces, along with everyone inside it. The body of the lift attendant was never recovered. And although Dufferin and his servants asked, nobody who worked in the hotel could even remember the man's name, for he had started work that very day. But what Dufferin does remember is that when he stared at the grandfather clock, he saw the time with dreadful clarity. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
I stared at the radio. Okay, I thought, that can't be too weird. I must have just found a station broadcasting ghost stories. After all, we were in the closing days before Christmas, so it was the ideal time of year for ghost stories. The station switched to static, and I tried to convince myself the story was just the final broadcast before they closed down for the evening. It was fine. Everything was fine. It was all fine. I scanned the stations again until I found one playing soft classical music. And the sudden wave of familiarity with Mozart chased away my doubts about the previous station, and I got comfy on the sofa. A meow came from the doorway, and I almost fell off the sofa. I turned to look across the room and noticed a black cat with a white bib and a white ring around one eye sitting in the gloom. It meowed again. "Where did you come from?" I asked. The cat didn't answer, thankfully, but padded across the room. It leapt up onto the coffee table and sat facing me, its tail curled around its body to cover its white paws. I couldn't decide if this was a good or a bad sign, although it did tell me that there was clearly a way into the house if the cat had gotten in, so security clearly wasn't brilliant. Still, I had wanted company, and now here was a cat to provide said company, and at least it might keep any mice away from my snacks. "Are you a friendly cat?" I asked. The cat responded by snuggling down into a loaf position, never taking its amber eyes off me. I took that as a yes. I got comfortable on the sofa, feeling glad I was no longer the only living thing in the room. The radio continued to burble with classical piano, and my eyelids drooped. As I nodded off, I heard another male voice. I opened one eye, but there was no one else in the room, just me and the cat, still staring at me intently. Sleep grabbed me before I could realise the voice was coming from the cat.
Johnny Reed was the grave digger. Now, naturally, this meant that he lived next to the graveyard, not a location that many people would like to dwell, but Johnny Reed was happy enough. He lived in a little cottage hard by the cemetery with his wife and their cat, Old Tom. Great beast of a creature, the sort of cat that you do not own, but that owns you, in a manner of speaking. He just wandered in from the darkness of the night one evening, a beast with one glowing green eye and a scar where the other should be. He used to sit on the lap of Johnny Reed or his wife with his little paws pressed over his wee nose and his tail swishing backwards and forwards as he sat in the warmth of the fireplace. And by the warmth of his fire was where Johnny Reed liked to be. His job was easy enough for the most part. All he had to do was go out and make sure that the graveyard was well kept and tended, and that people could go and visit their loved ones and find their graves beautifully kept and the grass trimmed short. But every now and again, when one of the parishioners died, Johnny Reed had harder work to do. And one evening, he heard the news that one of his local parishioners, Long Tom, had gone the way of all flesh and died in the night. And so the following morning, he was forced to gather up his tools, his shovel, which he put over his shoulder, a lantern in case he should be working into the dark, and of course, very important for the kind of work that he does, a little flask of something to keep him warm and keep his spirits up. Whiskey, no doubt. And that went into the inside coat pocket. And Johnny Reed kissed his wife goodbye, and with a small meow from Old Tom, out into the graveyard he went. He trudged all the way to where the grave was going to be, and then he began to dig. He dug all day into the long afternoon, and soon the sweat was running down his face. His arms were aching and his back as well. And he thought to himself that a little nip of the whiskey that he carried with him would help to set away the cold and warm him from the inside out. So he unscrewed the top of his flask and he took a little sip of the whiskey. He felt its warmth. It trickled down his throat and into his inward parts, and he began to feel that warm and pleasant glow, and he thought that another nip would do him some good, so he took another, and it would seem unlucky to take two without taking three, and so a third nip he had. And then he was about half finished the flask, and he thought that it seemed a shame to leave it half finished, and so he polished the lot off. Now, as will happen to many of us, when he began to grow very sleepy after drinking so much whiskey, he decided to sit down and rest his eyes for a few minutes. And so he found a likely looking tombstone and he placed his back against the cold rock and he shut his eyes to rest them for just a moment and fell into a deep sleep. At last, he awoke with a start and looked all around him to see the gravestones, the tombs, the sepulchres and the crypts bathed in the cold light of the moon. He had slept all through the day. The sun had gone down below the horizon and the moon had risen up and now cast weird shadows through the dark, tangled trees and the tombstones of the graveyard. And Johnny Reed began to grow afraid, for, this was back in the days when superstition prevailed and graveyards at night were believed to be the haunts of spectres and ghouls and such like creatures. And so Johnny Reed began to look around him nervously. And it was then that he first heard the sound in the distance, through the trees and the memorial stones to the dead. He heard a sound strange in that place and mournful. A yowling sort of sound, moving closer. And then he looked and he saw coming through the blackness of the night were little lights, like tiny candles, being borne towards him in great number. And he saw that the flickering orange flames of the candles were accompanied each by two burning lights, green or yellow. And they came towards him and grew larger and larger and larger, and Johnny Reed began to grow afraid. He trembled, and he tried to find somewhere to hide himself. And so he found the tombstone that he had been resting his back against, and quickly he nipped behind it, and placing only his hands and his wee eyes over the top, he peered to see what might be approaching, and the sound began to grow louder still. An awful, mournful, dreadful noise coming through the darkness of the night, and those little yellow or green lights grew larger and larger still, until Johnny Reed could see by the light of the candles what approached. Of course, you will have guessed by the sound what it was that approached, for it was cats. Hundreds and hundreds of cats, great villainous looking beasts with sharp claws that prowled through the soft grass of the graveyard, making that awful, mournful, howling sound, yowling up to the skies and the moon. And he saw that in their paws they clutched long candles and tapers. And the cats, carrying their candles, walked past in a sort of procession, right by the gravestone where Johnny Reed hid himself. And after the cats with the candles had passed him by, he saw that then 6 cats, big beasts, black with white spots on their chests, carried aloft a tiny coffin. And the coffin was covered with black velvet, and resting on top of it was a tiny golden crown. And they marched off into the darkness, that noise growing quieter as they disappeared into the blackness of the night. Now, Johnny Reed, as you might imagine, seeing something so strange and unnatural, was all a quiver. His skin crawled like a nest of ants. Till he stood up from behind the gravestone. He thought to himself, well, I could follow those cats and try and see where they're going and what they are up to. But I don't want to. I want to go home and sit by my fire with my own little cat and with my wife next to me. And I want my wife to tell me that everything's okay and perhaps make me a nice warm cup of tea. And so he lit his lantern, put his shovel over his shoulder, and began to make his way back to the entrance to the graveyard in the opposite direction to the direction in which the cats had gone. His feet crunched on the gravel, and at every slight sound he seemed to start and look about him, as if he feared that he might be followed. But it was not anything following his footsteps that he needed to be afraid of. For as he approached the great iron gates of the churchyard, he saw that what he feared was already in front of him. For his lantern light was flung back and reflected at him from hundreds of tiny pairs of eyes. There, a great mass of sleek cats was waiting for him by the iron gates, and the lantern light shone from the sharp claws on the ends of their paws and their bright and gleaming eyes that fixed him with their stare. He made towards them, but they moved not an inch. They stared at Johnny Reed, and he at them, till at last one brute came forwards from the mass and spoke. Johnny Reed. Johnny pointed to himself. Me? Johnny Reed, said the cat. Aye, said Johnny Reed, the gravedigger. Johnny Reed, said the cat. Tell Tom Tildrum Tim Toldrum's deed. Deed, said Johnny Reed. Aye, deed, said the cat. And Johnny nodded and solemnly promised that He would tell what they had asked, if only they would let him past. And with that, the cats moved slowly to either side of the gate, and the gate swung open before Johnny Reed. And looking to either side of him, he quickly hurried out through the gates and ran as fast as his legs would carry him back to his own little cottage. And he burst in through the door, his skin as white as milk and his eyes wide like saucers. And his wife stared back at him in shock. "What's the matter with you?" she said, "and where have you been?" And he said, "Woman, never mind that now. Do we know who Tom Tildrum is? Because I've got to tell Tom Tildrum Tim Toldrum's deed, and I cannot tell Tom Tildrum Tim Toldrum's deed if I don't know who Tom Tildrum is to tell him now, can I?" And just as she was about to say that this was a very good point, their cat, Old Tom, turned to fix Johnny Reed with his one good eye and stood up on the wife's lap on his hind legs and began to rub his little paws together in horrid glee. He began to laugh. "Tim Toldrum's deed! Then I am the king of the cats." And with that, he shot off the wife's lap into the fireplace, whooped, vanished up the chimney and into the darkness of the night. And they never saw him ever again. Now, whether he reigned as king of the cats for long, and whether he was a good king or a bad one, I can't tell you. But what I can tell you is that the folk on both sides of the River Tyne for many years, if they saw something that was strange or uncanny, that they could not explain, they would say, "My, that is like Johnny Reed's cat."
I woke up with a start. I was cold, so cold. I struggled to move my limbs as I looked around me at a sea of grey fabric. It was only when I bumped my head against a hard plastic surface that I realised I was scrunched up on the back seat of my car. I just headbutted the car door. I forced myself upright, casting aside my blanket, and spotted my wind-up radio, bottle of water, torch and snacks on the front passenger seat. How did I get out here? I'd fallen asleep in the cottage in front of a roaring fire, with a black cat watching me from the coffee table, and now I was asleep in my car. What on earth had happened? I opened the back door and stumbled out into a drift of snow. A snowy landscape fell away in every direction, but there was no cottage in front of me. I parked in a lay-by, yes, but beyond the hedge was a lone hawthorn tree in a mound blanketed in soft snow. 3 stones formed a doorway of sorts against the side of the mound, with 2 standing upright and a third providing a lintel. I spotted a flat information board beside a stile in the hedge and wiped away its crust of snow. That cold slug of fear skated down my spine again as I read the faded writing. It wasn't just a mound, it was a burial mound. Add that to the lone tree, and I suddenly wondered if I'd ever been inside a cottage that apparently didn't exist, or if I'd been lured inside that mound. Thank God I hadn't eaten the chocolate that I'd found in the drawer. I hauled open the boot of the car, tossing in the reflective triangle that was still strapped to the back of the car. I grabbed the wheel wrench, which, being stainless steel, was the closest thing to iron that I had in a car, unless by some lucky coincidence something within the car itself was iron. I scraped the snow from all the windows and checked my phone. Ah, success! I had a signal. And some battery. The signal was weak, but it was there, and a bunch of notifications had come in during the night. I'd never been so glad to see a ton of messages in a WhatsApp group chat. I climbed into the driver's seat and, on a whim, tried the engine. It started first time, and I yelled in pure satisfaction. Whatever the good folk, as I suspected lived inside that mound, had wanted, they clearly had no use for me now. I pulled out of the lay-by and glanced in my rearview mirror. A black cat with a white bib and a white ring around its eye sat beside the stile. It smiled, and I shuddered, coaxing the car forward on the fresh, crunchy snow. The cat turned and disappeared under the stile. As I drove around the corner, I could have sworn I saw a woman dressed in white standing by the hawthorn tree, waving me farewell. Well, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this slice of Christmas creepiness. It featured the storytelling talents of, in order, Owen Staton from the Time Between Times podcast, Wayne Gilbert from the Eerie Edinburgh podcast, and Dave Silk, the storyteller coming to you from the heart of Old Newcastle. And you can find him at Dave Taleteller on Instagram. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.